In the sun-scorched sands of ancient Egypt, where the mighty Nile carved its life-giving path through the desert, there ruled a queen whose name would echo through millennia, Cleopatra VII Philopator. History has painted her as a seductress, a beauty beyond compare, but the truth is far stranger and more remarkable than any Hollywood portrayal could capture. Behind the golden mask of legend lies a woman whose intelligence, cunning, and sheer audacity defied every expectation of her time. These are not the stories you learned in school. These are the crazy, unbelievable, and absolutely true facts about the last pharaoh of Egypt, a woman who literally changed the course of human history. Prepare yourself for revelations that will completely shatter everything you thought you knew about one of history's most misunderstood figures. Picture this. The most famous queen of Egypt wasn't even Egyptian by blood. Cleopatra descended from Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's generals who claimed Egypt after Alexander's death in 323 BCE. For nearly 3 centuries, the Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt while maintaining their Greek-Macedonian heritage. And here's where it gets truly bizarre. They practiced brother-sister marriage to keep their bloodline pure. This wasn't just occasional intermarriage. We're talking about generations of siblings, marrying siblings, creating a family tree that looked more like a telephone pole. Cleopatra herself was married to not one, but 2 of her younger brothers, Ptolemy XIII and later Ptolemy XIV, though she had both of them killed when they became inconvenient to her rule. But here's what makes this even more incredible. The woman we think of as the quintessential Egyptian queen was actually more Greek than the Greeks themselves, speaking at least 9 languages fluently, including Egyptian, making her the first Ptolemaic ruler in 300 years to actually learn the language of the people she governed. Imagine ruling a country for 3 centuries without speaking the native language, and then along comes Cleopatra, who not only learned Egyptian, but became so fluent she could conduct religious ceremonies and legal proceedings in the ancient tongue that her ancestors had completely ignored. Legend tells of the most expensive dinner in human history, and Cleopatra was the one who ate it. During a lavish banquet with Mark Antony, she made a bet that she could spend 10 million sestertii, equivalent to millions of dollars today, on a single meal. Now, Mark Antony wasn't easily impressed. This was a man who had seen the wealth of Rome, who had conquered nations and plundered treasuries, but what happened next left him speechless. As Antony watched in disbelief, Cleopatra calmly removed one of her massive pearl earrings, each one worth more than entire provinces, dropped it into a cup of wine vinegar, and waited. The pearl began to dissolve, fizzing and bubbling as the acid ate away at layers of nacre that had taken decades to form in some distant oyster bed. Then, with the casual air of someone sipping morning wine, she drank the entire mixture, consuming what was essentially liquid real estate. The pearl was so valuable that it represented the wealth of entire nations, and she consumed it as casually as eating grapes. But here's the brilliant part. This wasn't just showing off, it was a calculated psychological warfare move that demonstrated Egypt's incomprehensible wealth and her own fearless extravagance, leaving Antony both impressed and slightly terrified of the woman he was dealing with. She was essentially saying, "I am so wealthy that I can literally drink fortunes, and so confident in my power that I can waste more money in one sip than most kingdoms see in a year." Here's a mind-bending fact that puts Cleopatra's place in history into perspective, and will completely change how you think about ancient history. When she ruled Egypt from 51 to 30 BCE, the Great Pyramid of Giza was already over 2,500 years old, ancient history even to her. Think about that for a moment. The pyramid was completed around 2560 BCE, making it closer in time to Cleopatra than Cleopatra is to us today. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon in 1969, only 1,999 years had passed since Cleopatra's death, while she lived 2,530 years after the pyramid's completion. This means that the iPhone in your pocket, invented in 2007, is closer in time to Cleopatra than she was to the construction of Egypt's most famous monument. To put this in even more perspective, Cleopatra lived closer to the opening of the first Pizza Hut than to the building of the pyramids. This fact completely reshapes how we think about ancient history and the vast spans of time that separate these iconic moments. When Cleopatra walked through the chambers of the Great Pyramid, she was essentially a tourist visiting an ancient monument, just like we are today. When Cleopatra needed to meet Julius Caesar for the first time, she didn't simply walk into his presence, she orchestrated perhaps history's greatest theatrical entrance, and the details are absolutely wild. Knowing that Alexandria was under siege and she couldn't enter the city normally, she devised a plan so audacious it sounds like something from a spy movie. She had herself wrapped in linen cloths and tied up inside a large carpet or linen sack, then had her loyal servant Apollodorus carry her like cargo through enemy lines and deliver her directly to Caesar's private chambers. Imagine Caesar's shock when what he thought was a gift delivery suddenly unrolled to reveal the Queen of Egypt herself, emerging like a butterfly from a cocoon, perfectly composed and ready to negotiate the fate of nations. But this paled in comparison to her legendary meeting with Mark Antony years later, an entrance so spectacular it made Hollywood jealous centuries before Hollywood existed. She sailed up the Cydnus River on a golden barge with purple sails, dressed as Aphrodite, the goddess of love, surrounded by children dressed as cupids fanning her with peacock feathers, while musicians played haunting melodies and exotic incense burned in golden braziers. The boat itself was a floating work of art, with silver oars keeping time to the music, and servants dressed as sea nymphs trailing silk streamers in the water. The entire city of Tarsus emptied to witness this spectacle, leaving Antony sitting alone in the marketplace as crowds flocked to the riverbank to see the Egyptian queen, who had transformed herself into a living goddess before their very eyes. Citizens climbed rooftops, pressed against windows, and lined the shores for miles just to catch a glimpse of this floating paradise that seemed to have sailed directly out of mythology. While Hollywood focuses on her beauty, the real Cleopatra was one of the most educated people of her time, a true Renaissance woman 2 millennia before the Renaissance was even a concept. She studied mathematics, philosophy, rhetoric, astronomy, and languages at the legendary Library of Alexandria, the ancient world's greatest center of learning, containing over 400,000 scrolls representing the accumulated knowledge of human civilization. But Cleopatra wasn't content to simply rule from a throne room. She wanted to understand the world around her at the deepest level. She conducted her own scientific experiments, including testing various poisons on condemned prisoners to find the most painless death, not out of cruelty, but because she was planning her own suicide and wanted to ensure it would be quick and dignified if the time came. Her notebooks, now lost to history, reportedly contained detailed observations about the effects of different toxins, their onset times, and the symptoms they produced. She wrote treatises on mathematics, medicine, and cosmetics, and her expertise in chemistry allowed her to create elaborate special effects for her public appearances that seemed like magic to observers. She could make flames change colors, create mysterious smoke that carried intoxicating perfumes, and produce cosmetics that literally glowed in torchlight. Her perfumes were so potent and distinctively blended that their scent would arrive hours before her ships came into view, announcing her presence across miles of Mediterranean coastline, like an aromatic herald proclaiming the approach of divinity itself. Everyone knows Cleopatra died from an asp bite, but here's the crazy truth that historians have been debating for centuries. She probably didn't die from a snake bite at all. Ancient sources describe her death as remarkably peaceful, with no visible wounds, no signs of snake bite trauma, no swelling, and no evidence of the violent convulsions that typically accompany cobra venom poisoning. Modern herpetologists point out that Egyptian cobras are unpredictable creatures that often don't inject lethal doses of venom, and even when they do, death is rarely as serene as described in historical accounts. The more likely scenario, and this is where Cleopatra's scientific mind comes into play, is that she used a carefully prepared cocktail of toxins that would ensure a quick, painless death while maintaining the dramatic symbolism of the sacred serpent. Remember, she had spent years researching poisons, testing numerous combinations on condemned prisoners, and had likely perfected a mixture of opium for peace, hemlock for quick effect, and other substances that would mimic the effects of a cobra bite while guaranteeing the result she desired. This wasn't just about dying, it was about controlling her own narrative even in death, ensuring she would be remembered as someone who chose her fate rather than submitting to Roman humiliation. She wanted a death that would deny Octavian the ultimate prize of parading her through Rome as a captive, turning what should have been his greatest triumph into a hollow victory over an empty cage. In one of history's greatest what-if moments, Cleopatra came incredibly close to creating a Greco-Egyptian empire that would have completely rewritten the story of Western civilization. Her son with Julius Caesar, Caesarion, was recognized by Caesar as his legitimate heir, and had Caesar not been assassinated on the Ides of March, the boy would likely have inherited both Rome and Egypt, uniting the entire Mediterranean world under a single crown that combined Roman military might with Egyptian wealth and Greek intellectual tradition. Imagine how different our world would be today if that had happened. Later, her children with Mark Antony were strategically positioned to rule vast territories across the eastern Mediterranean, creating a network of allied kingdoms that could have challenged Rome's dominance for centuries. Had Antony and Cleopatra won the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, and they came heartbreakingly close to victory, the entire course of Western civilization would have been different. Instead of the Roman Empire that gave us Latin-based languages and Roman law, we might have seen an Egyptian-Roman hybrid culture where Greek philosophy merged seamlessly with Egyptian mysticism, where the Library of Alexandria remained the eternal center of learning instead of being destroyed, and where a matriarchal society led by Cleopatra's descendants could have shaped the development of Christianity, Islam, and the modern world in ways we can barely imagine. We might be speaking Greek derivatives instead of Latin ones, worshipping in temples that combine Roman pragmatism with Egyptian spirituality, and living in a world where scientific advancement never suffered the Dark Ages because Alexandria's light never dimmed. But perhaps the most incredible thing about Cleopatra is how she managed to maintain Egypt's independence for nearly 2 decades against the most powerful empire in human history. While every other kingdom around the Mediterranean was being absorbed into Rome, Cleopatra played a chess game on an international scale, using her intelligence, charisma, and Egypt's vast wealth to keep her nation free. She spoke directly with Roman senators in flawless Latin, negotiated with Parthian kings in Persian, commanded her own naval fleets, and managed the complex logistics of feeding Alexandria, one of the ancient world's largest cities. She wasn't just a queen sitting on a throne, she was a hands-on ruler who personally oversaw everything from tax collection to military strategy, from religious ceremonies to international diplomacy. Her daily routine would have exhausted modern world leaders. She woke before dawn to review reports from across her kingdom, spent mornings in court hearing petitions from citizens, devoted afternoons to state correspondence and meetings with advisors, and often worked late into the night planning military campaigns or negotiating with foreign ambassadors, all while maintaining the elaborate public appearances and religious duties that came with being considered a living goddess by her people. The woman who ruled Egypt for nearly 2 decades packed more drama, intelligence, and sheer audacity into her 39 years than most civilizations achieve in centuries. Cleopatra wasn't just a queen, she was a scholar, a chemist, a master of propaganda, a military strategist, a skilled diplomat, a religious leader, and a woman who understood that in a world ruled by men, she would need to be smarter, bolder, and more unforgettable than anyone who came before her. Her legacy isn't just about beauty or seduction, it's about a brilliant mind that nearly reshaped the ancient world, a strategic genius who kept Egypt independent when every other nation was falling to Rome, and a leader whose influence continues to captivate us over 2,000 years after her death. She was the last pharaoh of Egypt, but she was also the first modern leader in many ways, someone who understood that power in the ancient world required not just armies and gold, but also psychology, theater, intelligence, and the ability to make people believe in something greater than themselves. In the end, Cleopatra achieved something that even the mightiest pharaohs before her couldn't: true immortality, not through mummification or monuments, but through the power of an extraordinary story that refuses to be forgotten. A legend so compelling that it has survived wars, empires, and millennia to still capture our imagination today.